Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
Afternoon. We've had requests, implicit bias. We've had the requests and topics for this, and so we're happy to invite Mr. Christopher Floor from Metro Nashville Public Schools and Dr. Taylor Biondi from Metro Nashville Public Schools. They will expand upon their introduction, but come on over, y'all. We're so glad you're here. Eager to hear what you have to say about implicit bias in IEPs.
Thank you.
All right.
We are excited to be here. So, like she said, my name is Taylor Biondi. I'm the RTI Behavior Coordinator for Metro Nashville Public Schools. And I'm really excited to be here today with you all.
And I'm Christopher Floor. I'm a transition coordinator and exceptional education coach with Metro Nashville Public Schools. I work with a number of high schools throughout the city, and we support a lot of IEP teams in trying to tackle issues of instructionally appropriate IEPs and also dealing with the issue of bias in IEPs.
Before we move any further, I do want to call out explicitly that we are two white people who are talking about implicit bias. And we're going to address that for a couple of different reasons. First, we want to acknowledge our own privilege in this situation and acknowledge that we're not going to center our experiences by any means. There are lots of other people that know much more about this topic than we do, but we're here to learn with you and learn alongside you. Secondly, it is not just the responsibility of people of color to speak on behalf of others with marginalized identities and to engage in this fight against implicit bias and disproportionate outcomes. Finally, we're not just talking about implicit bias when it comes to race. We're discussing implicit bias when it comes to all sorts of variations of your identity or a child's identity. So disability status, English learner status, gender, sex, sexuality, religion. There are so many identities that people bring to the table, and all of those have the potential to be impacted with implicit bias. So I just wanted to acknowledge that first, that we know that it might look a little odd to have two white people talking about implicit bias, but there are reasons why we're here, and there are reasons why you all are here to learn about this with us. And we're just really happy to spend the afternoon with you. So with that, we'll go ahead and talk through our norms for our time together today. We ask that you are vulnerable with us and be open to looking at some of your own subconscious or conscious thoughts. Look to your own growth first, primarily. So we're not going to call out other people, but we're going to focus on ourselves and accept this concept of non-closure. So we may not, probably won't, have all of the answers today, but we're going to do what we can to grow together. Additionally, we're going to assume best intentions. And what I mean by that is we're not going to assume automatically that someone has a negative intent, but we're going to look to the impact of that potential action and assume that people are just trying their best. I find that in most cases, if I assume that everyone is trying their best, I'm going to get a much better outcome out of that interaction. And then finally, practice mindfulness. If some of this kind of triggers something for you, or you find yourself getting stressed, or your emotions are getting a little overwhelming, that's okay. Notice that feeling, notice where that came from. Feel free to step out and take a breath if you need to, or just take some kind of count to yourself. I coach my son through Let's Count together all the time. So just notice feelings that may arise and then let them go. Our goal for the next hour with you is to talk about why implicit bias and disproportionate outcomes are dangerous to our students. identify implicit bias in IEP, so actually in like what is written into an IEP narrative or a present level, where might implicit bias show up there, and then prepare to address that when we're working with our peers and our colleagues. That's what our goals are for this time with you today. So I would love to hear some ideas for a fill-in-the-blank activity first. So the two orange blanks are the same word, and then the blue blank is another word. So do I have any guesses for what this orange blank may be?
Difficulties.
Difficulties, okay. Any other guesses for what the orange word might be?
Biases.
Biases, okay. So the answer is biases. So, well done, second person. That would have fit as well, difficulties. So the point isn't to get people to accept that they have biases, but get them to see that those biases have negative, what? What might fill in this blue blank?
Impact.
Impact.
Okay.
Any other guesses?
Outcomes.
Outcomes. Okay, both of those are technically right. The actual word is consequences. Great synonyms, everyone. So to get them to see that those biases have negative consequences for others. I know I have biases. I know that things pop into my brain that I can't control. But the goal here is to get everyone to pause for a second, acknowledge that bias, and see where that might impact other people.
So as we dive into today's session, we really want to develop a common lexicon amongst all of ourselves. And we're going to do that just by kind of going through some shared word knowledge so we have similar vocabulary and so that we're working off of the same working definitions of certain concepts. So the three key pieces today are for implicit bias. We'll also discuss and define what an equity lens is, and then talk about the idea of an instructionally appropriate IEP. So when it comes to implicit bias is the tendency to process information based on unconscious associations and feelings, even when these are contrary to one's conscious or declared beliefs. While implicit bias impacts everyone, the identities that are most harmed by implicit bias tend to be people from marginalized groups. So that could be individuals with disabilities, Black and Indigenous people of color, people from various gender, sexual identities, etc. And so the key question that you want to ask yourself when thinking about implicit bias, because sometimes that reflection piece is a challenge for people, is you just really need to ask yourself two questions. Do I have a brain? And do I live in a society? So raise your hand if you said yes to both of those questions. Okay, proudly and confidently in the air. Much better. So if you answer yes to both of those questions, you do have implicit bias.
So more practically, how that shows up often is what we'll call a false positive and a false negative. This is a term that we use sometimes in medical tests or in screeners, that we might, for a false positive, identify a student as needing support when they actually don't need that. So that's a false positive. We've identified them, but it's not true. They don't actually need that. A false negative is another way that implicit bias can show up, and that's when students are not provided the support that they need, when in fact they do need it. But for some reason or another, bias got in the way, and they did not receive the support that they required. So this might look like, for a false positive, when a student is given more time in special education than what they actually need. The false positive is that we've applied more support than is warranted based on our bias about that child. A false negative, in a more practical example, is when a student has skill deficits that should be addressed in the IEP, but they're not addressed because of a bias that we might have. For example, we might ascribe that deficit to some aspect of their identity, or just that's the way it is, and not provide them the service that they need. That is an example of a false negative.
So then that brings us into the discussion of how resources are allocated. And when we're having conversations about identity, it's really important that we reflect these conversations through an equity lens. And so an equity lens confirms the importance of recognizing institutional and systemic barriers and discriminatory practices where students thereby have limited access to success for students in the education system. In addition to that, an equity lens emphasizes historically disadvantaged students, such as out-of-school youth, emerging English language learners, students in community of color, some rural geographic locations, and we want to make sure that we continue to have a focus on racial equity in these conversations, especially given the historical research that we've been finding in the world of special education over the past 40 years. So the Oregon Educational Investment Board defines an equity lens as the result of creating a culture of equity, which focuses on outcomes of academic proficiency, civic awareness, workplace literacy, and personal integrity. And the systemic outcomes that focus on resource allocation, engagement, communication, data collection, and analysis of educator hiring, preparation, and development. So we're really looking at all different angles in the system that are producing inequitable outcomes. Now, when we're thinking about instructionally appropriate IEPs, how many here have looked at the Tennessee Department of Education IEP rubric in this room? Hands high. Okay, so most people, right? And so generally, when we're thinking about instructionally appropriate IEPs, we are thinking about this rubric to define what that looks like. But we really want to enhance that conversation to add an equity lens to the instructionally appropriate IEP. So when you're considering implicit bias, you really want to think about how the bias is impacting how the IEPs are written. And up on the screen is a prime example of that. And so some of the print might be a little small in here, so we'll kind of walk you through this. So on this graph, we see the percentage of students who are aged 5 through 21 served through IDEA within different racial and ethnic groups. And so if you're looking at the solid color, right here, that's students who are included in the regular classroom with typical peers for 80% of the day or more. And then on the next level, you have students who are in the regular class for 40 to 79% of the day, students who are in the regular class for less than 40% of the day, and then students who are being educated in other environments, okay? And so you'll see there are definitely racial and ethnic implications on the setting where students are receiving services. And so this goes back to that resource allocation question of students getting services that they do not need or students getting too many services, right?
So our big picture takeaway from this slide is that students of color are much more likely to be educated in a separate environment or in less inclusive settings than white students. And so now we'll talk about why do we care so much about that? Why does that particular fact matter? So we know that for a very long time, we have been working towards improving special education outcomes and improving the services that we provide our students with disabilities. But the current standing is that right now, students who receive special education are more likely to have lower NAEP scores, they have lower high school graduation rates, and higher unemployment. And though we work as educators very hard to improve these outcomes, over time, the level of achievement has been much lower for our students with disabilities than it has been for students without disabilities. These outcomes continue after high school graduation. So students with disabilities or students who receive special education services as children are less likely to enroll in post-secondary education. They're less likely to live independently. They're less likely to have signs of financial independence, like owning a checking account. And they're much more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. So things like being stopped by police for other than speeding on I-40. This is bad news. We know this. We know that this also hasn't changed a whole lot in the past several decades. And we show this to you not to depress the crowd, but to acknowledge that what we are doing is very important work. We also want to acknowledge that hope is not lost. Just because the outcomes right now are not great, we do know that inclusion works. The more we can include students with disabilities with their non-disabled peers, the better their outcomes there are. So for students with math and reading disabilities, their achievement goes up when they spend more time in general education. Students with autism also score much higher on achievement scales when they spend more time with their non-disabled peers. Students with intellectual disabilities are much more likely to make progress when they are with their general education peers. So inclusion is so important. We know that inclusion works. High quality IEPs help make sure that students are getting access to that inclusion. But the fact is that some students are more likely than others to get access to that high quality inclusive environment that's going to make all the difference in their long-term outcomes. So Chris is going to talk now about a very specific case study that was done in Wisconsin about how and which students are more likely to have access to those high quality IEP indicators compared to other groups.
So we actually had the privilege of getting this information from the Metro Madison School District in Wisconsin in our participation with the Urban Collaborative for Special Education. And so they shared this internal research with districts around the country. And so basically what happened was in 2019 and 2020, there was a disproportionality determination that came from the Department of Education in Wisconsin to Metro Madison School District. And what they found was that Black scholars were overrepresented in special education in categories such as emotional and behavioral disability, intellectual disability, specific learning disability, and other health impairments as well. Black scholars with IEPs were also overrepresented in disciplinary referral numbers, and Black scholars with an IEP were overrepresented by being pulled from the inclusive setting. So they were spending more time in restrictive settings. So the Metro Madison School District developed and submitted an improvement plan with the Department of Education, and they began with an internalized review of how IEPs were written throughout that school district. And so beginning in 2021, they specifically were looking at IEPs of students who had emotional and behavioral disabilities. And they were also screening that for students who were identified as white by the family or students who were identified as Black or multiracial, with Black being one of the categories identified. And through a statistical analysis of the IEPs, they found a lot of themes. And they're currently in the process over the last couple of years of expanding the question of how they're looking at disabilities, so they're looking at different categories, and also looking at the different tiers. This group in particular that was responsible for this named themselves the Anti-Racist IEP Committee. And so when we're thinking about the functional performance of students, right, we're talking about student strengths in the beginning of an IEP. They found racial discrepancies in how this section of the IEP was written in their district. For instance, academic strengths were referenced in the IEPs of white students 70% of the time, okay? As compared to only 39% for students of color. In addition to that, the strengths section that referenced athletics was mentioned for 37% of Black students, but only 14% of white students. And so you'll even know here in the state of Tennessee, there is a huge emphasis on taking the time to address academic strengths within the IEP. But in some cases, those academic strengths are not being addressed, and the teams are defaulting on things like social categories and sports and different things like that. It's a huge issue. Now, looking at the next part, they were examining the functional performance, so basically what we would consider PLEPs, right? And they found the content of how these PLEPs were written. Now, keep in mind, these are all students with emotional or behavioral disabilities, okay? They found that physical and verbal aggression was being referenced over 50% of the time for Black students, as compared to about a quarter of the time for white students. They also noted that over 50% of the time, black students were engaging in refusal behaviors, and that was only 35% of the time for white students. And then even using the words, like saying the word incapable, was used for 30% of black students, which is a huge issue.
Chris, I just wanted to clarify quickly, like these numbers are from only students with emotional behavior disabilities. Because we know already that black students are much more likely than white students to be identified as having an emotional disability, but they just pulled from that group, so it's from that group of students. And so we're not just talking about like all of the white students with disabilities compared to all of the black students. We're talking about within ED, this is how it broke out.
And I would be very interested in seeing some of their updated data as they expanded their analysis to different disability categories. So when you're looking at the program summary, they also found discrepancies in how IEP goals were written. So for instance, annual IEP goals that were considered high quality according to their metrics were only rated as such for 13% of the time for black students and 28% of the time for white students. So they were having instructionally appropriate issues across the board, but they were less instructionally inappropriate for the white students as compared to black students. They found that almost half the time for black students, there was no baseline that the goal was referencing in the present levels. And then also only 6% of students who were black had goals that related to self-advocacy as compared to half the time for white students. And then there was a huge discrepancy in specifically designed instruction. So that's time spent in the special education setting. And they found that students eligible under emotional and behavioral disabilities were 2.7 times more likely, if they were black, to be included in the special ed setting as opposed to white students. And so that's a huge difference because that already tells us that black students in Metro Madison had less access to the general education curriculum. So for those of you who have been here with us before, know that we spend a lot of time grappling with this concept of how like different ideas interact and intercept with each other, right? And so the two big concepts that we're talking about today are this idea of the instructionally appropriate IEP, but also what is equitable or inequitable. And the question is can those two things exist on a separate continuum? Okay? Is it possible to have an instructionally appropriate IEP that is inequitable in its nature or produces inequitable outcomes? Or can you have an instructionally inappropriate IEP, one that's not instructionally appropriate, that produces equitable outcomes? I'm already looking at all y'all's faces and seeing that the math doesn't math with that, right? Something isn't making sense. Our vision needs to be that instructionally appropriate IEPs are equitable for all students based on regardless of their identity. And there clearly is a disconnect in districts around the country. And you see that in disproportionality numbers, you see that in the analysis that's happening in Madison, and you're actually going to take some time to see some samples from Metro Nashville Public Schools that kind of begin to hint that we're having the same issues in our district as all y'all might be having in yours.
So with that, we're going to go into some sample case studies. We'll ask you to take out your phones and use this QR code. So you, if you're not familiar with QR codes, you open up the camera on your phone and shine it up to the little thing with the dinosaur in it, and then you'll click the link that pops up. That's going to take you to essentially a slideshow that has several different students' present levels or the narratives in their IEPs. So we'll ask you to find a buddy, so get with a friend or a group of 3, if that makes more sense for the way that you're seated. And then we will have this half of the room look at the odd numbered students, so all of them have a number on them. So this half of the room is going to look at the odd number of students, and then this half of the room is going to look at the even numbered students. Any questions about those directions?
I do have one tip. So when you get to the Genially, you'll want to turn your phone on its side, and once you turn it on its side, you'll be able to see the full image. And we will come around and try to support you in accessing the information if you're having a hard time. Got it. I don't know how you did it. I don't know how I did it either, so I'm glad I did. All right, what are we doing?
Like, why would you tell me?
All good over here?
All right, we'll come back together in about 15 seconds. First, I'm going to be looking for someone on this half of the room to tell us about at least one of the students they read about, and what did they notice? Where might implicit bias be creeping into these IEP samples? And what's the potential impact on the student? So do I have any willing sharers on this half of the room to talk about the odd numbered kids? Yes, hold on just a second until we get you a mic. Thank you.
Well, first I noticed the difference with one student had an advocate and another did not. And my question that came to my mind was, what are the resources as far as the Parent Resource Center that are available in the district itself? And are the parents receiving the training that they require to also become active participants in a meaningful IEP?
Yeah, I think that's great to call out that parent resources, the parents' knowledge of their rights is often really indicative to IEP quality. I know I have seen that quite a bit, and I'm sure many of you have seen that as well, that the presence of an advocate may completely change how we go about writing that particular document. Any others on this side of the room that would like to share? Yes.
So I was looking at the 7th grader, Ethan, the very first one. His eligibility category, the first one isn't mentioned, like the reading. They only mentioned the OHI in there.
Yeah, so like completely ignoring.
They completely ignored one category.
A disability category. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what do you not to put too fine a point on it, but like what's the impact of that statement, of that?
Well, some of the things they've attributed to the OHI may not really be the OHI. It may be actually the reading disability.
Right.
The part here where it says it's mostly in reading makes me think that it's not so much the OHI in the reading, it's the reading disability. They're not matching the students where he's at.
Right.
So he's acting out, and it looks like ADHD or ODD or something other for the OHI category.
Right, and so I think that's a great example of disability status and disability category being area of bias. That we assume that some students, well, it can't possibly be that they have a reading disability because all of this is because they're squirrely and they're not paying attention. So thinking through all aspects of a child's identity when we're writing the IEP and making sure that they're getting all of the services that they need.
A lot of our students have both, or at least
Yeah.
in my county they do.
Yeah.
If you have ADHD, you're much more likely to have a reading disability and vice versa.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, we'll take a couple from this side of the room. Now we're moving on to our even. Oh, we have a question back here. Yes?
Actually have a question. I couldn't hear really well what some of them were saying, but on one of the ones we looked at, the young man had an advocate, but in the paperwork there was no parental information, no parental concern. So how is that IEP being addressed and progressed without parental input?
Yeah, I think that's another thing that happens too when advocates come in, that we start listening to what that advocate wants or thinks is right and paying less attention to the student's needs and what the parent wants for their child. So I think that's a great thing to call out as well. Okay, someone on this side, we're looking at the even numbered students now. Got one over here.
I looked at student 8, which was Enrique, and I noticed that in a lot of it, it jumps back and forth between two names. It says Justin in it also. So my concern here is, are we copy pasting? Like, do we know the actual student? Do we call him Justin? But also it says Enrique. So there's some questions.
Hope is that Justin is a nickname.
but it also says Enrique. So then you're like, it says no parent concerns. But when you look at it, it's a Latino male, so do we have a way to communicate with the parents? Like, are we actually communicating in their preferred language? Do they understand what we're asking them, and are we able to understand what they're saying to us?
Yeah, and have we made sufficient attempts to get the parent to talk to us and share? One thing that I really get on my soapbox about is that we as school professionals have to go out of our way to make parents feel comfortable when they come into our buildings. Many parents, for a variety of different reasons, feel uncomfortable in a school setting. That might be because of their linguistic differences, it might be because of their own personal experiences at school, or because of the huge power dynamic shift when they walk into a building and they see lots of people with professional clothes on that they don't know the names of, and they don't know who is sitting at this table. It's really scary to come into a school meeting if you've never been to one before. So we have to go out of our way to make sure that parents not only feel welcome in the building, but feel like they are important and absolutely necessary to developing this plan for their child. Anyone else on this side want to share about something they noticed from an even-numbered student? Yes.
We did notice that on one of the students, it was pointed out, Justin, a black male, that he has good sportsmanship and is a good athlete, as you had pointed out earlier on the slides.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. That's what Madison, Wisconsin found. But I would love to have my own little research team to do a deep dive into what do IEPs look like across Tennessee and see if we're seeing the same themes pop up, and my guess is that we would. Thank you all so much for sharing, for going through and looking and trying to identify some instances of implicit bias in an IEP document. So that was one of our outcomes that we wanted to do, is practice looking at where is this showing up for our IEPs. The next thing that we're going to discuss is, once we notice it, what do we do about it?
How many of you all have read the book Courageous Conversations About Race? Hands. Okay, if you have not, you can purchase it from Dr. Singleton, who produced this book in 2014. But we're going to talk about a few of the concepts that really are going to give you the tools to kind of create what I call disruptive questions in IEP meetings. Because when we see these patterns of bias, we really need to disrupt what is happening, right? If a student is being disproportionately overserved, we need to disrupt that narrative. And the way we do that is by looking at who we are as we come into conversation on IEP teams, and then also looking at the people who are around us. And so when having courageous conversations about race or any identity, it's very important that we think about the whole person at play as we enter these conversations. Are we approaching things from a moral point of view or an intellectual point of view? What about how this all relates to our behavior? Do we say one thing and then not do it or follow up in our action? And then also, what are our feelings as we're having these conversations? This is critical when we're thinking about the families that are participating on these IEP teams, right? How many parents that we've worked with have their own institutional trauma coming in from their own educational experience, and now they're going through cycles of it with their students? Do we even consider that when we have these conversations? If we're not looking at the students that we support and the families that we're working with and our peers as whole people, these conversations are going to go off track, and these biases and disproportionalities are going to continue to thrive in our system. Okay? And so when you're thinking about that moral compass, right, that whole person, there's basic agreements that you want to keep to. And so part of that is to be engaged in conversation. How many times are we having IEP meetings and there are members who are completely disengaged from the discussion? You're on Microsoft Teams. Someone has their camera off. You ask someone a question. Nobody answers. Are we even speaking our truth when we're having these conversations? Are we brave enough to create conversations that are uncomfortable? And then, are we expecting and accepting the fact that there may be non-closure on some of these cases? We may not achieve some of the goals that we're hoping for on an IEP team. A student may become eligible when we don't think that they need to be. These things are going to happen because these systemic issues are massive in size. You're looking at an entire country, 50 states, and these patterns are popping up everywhere.
I also want to call out and kind of model that we use these agreements when we're talking with you. So when we started our session and I said, we are two white people, we don't have all of the answers. It was a little uncomfortable, I'm gonna be honest, but I said it because that was my truth and where I needed to how I needed to present myself to you all. So when you're having these courageous conversations, it is going to be uncomfortable, but if you follow these kind of tenets to help guide the way that you speak, it will, maybe give you a little bit more courage, and that's how we want to approach these situations.
So there's also discussion on how what conditions are needed to make these conversations possible. And we really want you all to think about IEP teams as opportunities to have these courageous conversations. So you do need to focus on what is personal, local, immediate. Think about the parent's experience. Think about your experience or the child's experience. Isolate race, isolate identity, and try to parse out how all of that is impacting the decision-making on an IEP team. You want to normalize social construction. Understand that there's multiple perspectives at hand. Also continue to monitor agreements and to refer back to them. Establish some parameters. And then also create working definitions around identity. Create working definitions around race. How many of you all have a DEI office in your district? Great opportunity that they provide great resources in how to construct these working definitions. And then also examine the presence and the role of whiteness, okay? I was looking at data from, this is a little old, it might be over 10 years old, but you were looking at when Memphis was still its own school district, so now you know it's a little old. And we were comparing how the school districts were identifying students as having an emotional disability. And we found that Nashville was over-identifying students with emotional behavioral disabilities. So why was that? Well, look at the color of the faculties. There was great variation in the color of the faculty from Memphis, between Memphis and Nashville. And if we are not having those conversations, we are not going to move the goalpost. One great example of this was brought up to me by my boss just the other day. And she had a nephew that was in Michigan, and they were trying to identify him as having an emotional and behavioral disability. And someone in the IEP team paused and said, now hold on a second. He's gone through this trauma. They've had a change in home. He lost his uncle just a year and a half ago. He's had to move. Think about all of these situations. And the team in this case, because it was addressed, actually changed course and opted to just provide basic RTIB supports as opposed to putting a label on a child that may follow him throughout his educational career. So this is critical. And so as we move on to the next slide, we really want you to think about what those disruptive questions might sound like. Think about a case where you need to ask, how do I feel about this? How does this parent feel? How does all this information make you feel? And then also, do the actions of the IEP teams or your actions as an individual, do they correspond with the decisions that teams are making? Or the missions of your school district? Or the missions of the individual schools that you all work with? And then, how does bias in your own IEP writing or report writing or IEP team decision making expose certain beliefs that you may hold about race and disability and gender identity, et cetera, that you may not even be aware of? Because remember, we all have bias. And so if we're not asking ourselves these critical questions, we are not going to disrupt these patterns. And so then my parting question to you is, now what will you do moving forward? Now what are you going to do?
So that leads us to our final activity, where we're going to reflect on some of the things that we've discussed today. We've moved from learning about what implicit bias means to identifying it in an IEP document, and then some practical, we hope, examples of how to address that in real life. So we've got another QR code that you'll pull up with your phone, and it's got a number of questions on it. You don't have to answer all of the questions, but go through and look at them. Choose 2 or 3 to respond to, and add a comment. So we'll let you kind of think individually, independently for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll go back and comment on, respond to your colleagues' answers. And I'm going to keep an eye on it on my computer, and we'll call out comments that are particularly impactful for the conversation.
And if you all notice, we have given this presentation at different conferences, and so you'll actually get to see what other conference participants at other conferences have had to share and have had to offer in terms of resources. I do want to point you in the direction of question 7 as well, that basically just says, hey friend, I recommend this resource to help sharpen your equity lens. And so that way we can all continue to build our toolbox together and collectively.
So one of the questions, I'm just going to narrate for our virtual audience, is list 2 to 3 ways implicit bias may shape how IEP meetings are run. So some of the comments in here, the willingness to hear other perspectives or conflicting opinions, moving through a meeting quickly because the parent doesn't understand anyway, the way a parent presents themselves, such as wearing certain types of clothing or a vulgar tattoo, the way that person might be known in the community is going to impact how we treat them in the meeting. Not understanding cultural norms may change the way IEP teams interpret behavior. So I think these are all really great examples of how implicit bias can creep into those meeting practices, not just the document, but the norms of how the meeting itself is run.
One thing I want to highlight is that someone under question 7, I think, put a link to an entire training on implicit bias and microaggressions in special education. Not one of the ones that we developed, so I'm going to want to check that one out.
Chris has his homework now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Someone's recommending Brene Brown's work on creating brave spaces and having tough conversations. We have a document on how to respond to microaggression.
One question that is listed is, how does the state's expectations about IEP quality play a role in limiting bias Where does it fall short, and how do you close the gap? Someone said, if an IEP is appropriately written and the guidelines are followed, then implicit bias should be limited, but it's still possible to be present in the IEP. This goes back to Chris's earlier point that our kind of thesis is that IEP cannot be instructionally appropriate and inequitable. So if we have instructionally appropriate IEPs, they are more likely to lead to equitable outcomes. But that's absolutely correct that that is not alone going to solve all of the problems for our students.
Yeah. And then just to add on to that, so Metro, we didn't share this because there were a lot of tools that Metro Madison developed, and we wanted to take this conversation in a different direction. But they actually created like a rubric that was ancillary to their own IEP quality rubric, and it was called the Anti-Racist IEP Rubric. I believe if you look up Metro Madison Public Schools website, you should be able to find a link to that Anti-Racist IEP rubric if you were curious about it. And then one thing I can do is see if I can find a link to it and then add it to this document so you can just see some of the things that Madison was doing to address these issues.
So we'll take one more minute here for you to kind of like or comment, respond to your colleagues' comments on the questions, and then we will kind of close our formal session and move on to questions, if you all have any.
The last thing I want to shout out is somebody noted the hidden disproportionality of sexual and gender identity in IEPs. A hidden disproportionality. How do you study that?
Great question. Another hidden demographic I have come across is students who are Middle Eastern or North African or may identify as Arabic or Muslim. That is a whole demographic ethnicity of people that is not captured in our racial demographic information. So that's something that's really, that I think about a lot, that we don't have a good way to track those students and see. We don't even know if their outcomes are disproportionately low or high or anything, because we have no way of tracking those students because they are very often coded as white or Asian, which doesn't really represent their full identity. Does anybody want to call out anything specific about what they've seen, what they're seeing in the comments? Or we can move on to just a general question and answer. Just a second, we got a mic coming to you.
I've always had a loud voice, so. One of the comments about shortening a meeting or going through something quickly because the parent would not understand anyway. I know I've seen that a lot of times. Sometimes we do that because we think, okay, they're not getting this, they're not understanding. I had a meeting the other day. A parent said, yes, call at 8 a.m. We called at 8 a.m. We could clearly tell we woke the parent up. And it was, are you good to go ahead with this meeting? So, yeah, that's fine. But I was proud of my team because they did go through every part of the IEP, went through and made a good point to try to engage mom and let her know and give her some accolades because she was a young mother, 6 children. This one is the first one with an IEP. And it was just engaging her, and so she did. She felt more of a team, and you could tell she was waking up throughout the rest of the meeting, and just letting her know her rights and letting her know that she can call us at any point in time if she came from another school district that her experiences were not as great. So just wanted to let her know that she was welcome in Rutherford County, and her student was welcome, and we'll do everything we can to help them to be successful. So it ended up being a good meeting.
Good, thanks for sharing. I think that's a great example of like going out of your way to say, no, we really want you here. We really need your input.
One thing I want to add to that is how often do we interrogate the informed consent of parents, not to them, but to ourselves as IEP teams. So, Devola, you just brought up a great point, because we had an IEP meeting earlier this summer on our summer assessment team where we had Accutrans acting as translator for a family, and they were Spanish speaking. And the sense that we got during the eligibility meeting was that there was still a disconnect, even with the presence of a translator. And so when we got off that meeting, the psychologist turned to me and said, I don't really think this parent gave their informed consent today. I don't really think this parent was able to engage in this discussion, and something's missing in the communication. And we actually turned that around by actually bringing the team. We did a home visit, and the conversation evolved so much more fluidly and organically when the interpreter was face-to-face with the family. And sometimes families need that. But you have to remember, informed consent is informed consent. And if there's any question on an IEP team as to whether or not informed consent is being provided, it's probably not.
We had a question in the back.
I didn't have a question, but I had a comment. It was kind of like yours. I had a student that came from another out of state, so we won't, just another state. And she was a fourth grader, 10 years old, and was visually impaired and did not know how to read, did not know Braille, had not been ever exposed. And it was, we discovered it was due to implicit biases, assuming that the mother had multiple children, had never been invited to the IEP meeting. Basically, the child just came to school every day and listened to music, and that's all she did. And so she came to our school, and the mom was very understandably distrusting, didn't come to the first couple of meetings. Like, it took a lot of time to build trust with her. And then by the end of the year, the child was reading Braille, and had started to read Braille, and she just assumed that her daughter couldn't. She's like, oh, my daughter can't do anything. She has intellectual disabilities. She did not have an intellectual disability. She was misdiagnosed. She needed to learn Braille. That's what she needed. And so I say that because our team was amazing, but they took the time to build the relationship with the parent and work through those biases and those things to help her get to where she needed to go. And that the moral of that is that it can change the trajectory of a child's life by just doing that.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that is so important. Imagine that we taught the child to read, and now she can read. And you're so right. That completely changes the trajectory of her life. So I think that's just kind of another example of what we do every day is so important, and we have the chance to really make an impact on children. Yes?
To jump off of that informed consent part is, so I'm a parent of children with disabilities as a special ed teacher. And I was a special ed teacher before my children came. So I follow all the things, you follow the advocates, you follow the lawyers. And one thing that a lawyer had said in just a little Facebook thing was, don't sign the IEP right then and there. And she gave the reason why. Because if you think about all the changes that we go through during that IEP meeting, yes, we give them a draft, but just the little changes. I know how many changes I make just because of typos, and you don't see it until it's up there on the big screen.
It's highlighted, it's written all over.
And you've got that regular ed teacher going, your grammar is wrong there. And you're like, special ed. But it was informed consent. You give that parent a chance and say, hey, I'm going to make I'm going to make the changes that we've talked about. I'm going to send you home the new draft. And and give you a few days to read this document that you've only spent an hour, at a minimum, this document's 9 pages. At a minimum, this document's 9 pages. To go over it on your own time, in tiny print. And hey, could you get it back to me in 2 days?
Yeah.
Signed.
Yeah.
And I feel like that could just change so much, that parents' involvement and protect us as well.
Right.
Kind of covering your butt.
Yeah, that's a great idea, a good practice that we could think of incorporating into our regular programming that might have a huge difference. Other questions, comments, or ideas? Yes?
But with that being said, also parents need to understand that if there is something that needs to be changed, it needs to be brought to us as soon as possible, because there is a leeway there that we can meet and change it if it is. And sometimes you don't even have to meet if it's within 24 hours.
Right.
I think a lot of times parents don't know their rights because they don't read that book. So if you don't go over their rights with them at their meetings, or you don't let them know what their rights are, then they're not going to know that they do have that ability.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Even for some parents that maybe have been to many IEP meetings, and we say, you know what's in this book, right? And they're like, I don't need that. No, it takes 3 minutes to really go through and talk about what does this mean, instead of just kind of moving forward and rushing through, because we're rushed, right? Like, we have a lot going on, but I think that is another great practice that could really meaningfully impact how much implicit bias actually changes a student's life.
If it's an initial IEP, I can spend 35 minutes going through the procedural safeguards. If you're in a manifestation determination and you don't turn to page 27 and talk about the section on addressing discipline with students with disabilities, that's a huge disservice to families.
Yeah, because they teach whole courses on this, and parents are expected to understand in a 1 minute speed read. So I think that's a great point to pull out. Other thoughts? I like to say I'm really good at wait time, and I'll just stare at people for a while just to make sure you have plenty of time to digest in case there's anything that's percolating under the surface. Okay. Well, that's all we had. Thank you so much for your attention. We really appreciate you being here. You're doing the good work. There is so much work to be done, and I'm glad you're here. I'm glad to learn with you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you all for doing the heavy lifting. I love trainings where you all are carrying a lot of the weight, and you guys did a great job. Thank you so much.